Alright, boys and girls, we have been reading a book about Flat Stanley by Mr. Jeff Brown. And what we know so far is Flat Stanley is a regular boy, or he was, until one day he woke up and a bulletin board had landed on him and turned him flat. Now, Flat Stanley has had several adventures that we have read about, but now is perhaps the most exciting one yet. Remember that Stanley is in an art museum and he is going to catch some sneaky thieves. Let's go ahead and read and see what happens with those thieves. Now remember that Flat Stanley got hung up on a wall to look like a piece of art. It was very dark in the main hall. A little bit of moonlight came in through the windows, and Stanley could just make out the world's most expensive painting on the opposite wall. He felt as though the bearded man with the violin and the lady on the couch and the half-horse person and the winged children were all waiting as he was for something to happen. Time passed and he got tireder and tireder. Anyone would be tired this late at night, especially if he had to stand in a picture frame balancing on little spikes. Maybe they won't come, Stanley thought. Maybe the sneak thieves won't come at all. The moon went behind a cloud, and then the main hall was pitch dark. It seemed to get quieter, too, with the darkness. There was absolutely no sound at all. Stanley felt the hair on the back of his neck prickle beneath the golden curls of the wig. Creak! The creaking sound came from right out in the middle of the main hall, and even as he heard it, Stanley saw in the same place a tiny yellow glow of light. The creaking came again, creak, and the glow got bigger. A trap door had opened in the floor, and two men came up through it into the hall. Stanley understood everything all at once. These must be the sneak thieves. They had a secret trapdoor entrance into the museum from outside. That was why they had never been caught. And now tonight they were back to steal the most expensive painting in the world. He held very still in his picture frame and listened to the sneak thieves. "This is it, Max," said the first one. "This is where we art robbers pull a sensational job while the civilized community sleeps." "Right, Luther," said the other man. "In all this great city there's no one to suspect us." "Ha ha," thought Stanley Lambchop. "That's what you think." The sneak thieves put down their lantern and took the world's most expensive painting off the wall. "What would we do to anyone who tried to capture us, Max?" the first man asked. "We would kill him. What else?" his friend replied. That was enough to frighten Stanley, and he was even more frightened when Luther came over and stared at him. "This sheep girl," Luther said. "I thought sheep girls were supposed to smile, Max. This one looks scared." Just in time, Stanley managed to get a faraway look in his eyes again, and to smile, sort of. "You're crazy, Luther. She's smiling, and what a pretty little thing she is, too." That made Stanley furious. He waited until the sneak thieves had turned to the world's most expensive painting, and he shouted in his loudest, most terrifying voice, "Police! Police! Mr. Dart! The sneak thieves are here!" The sneak thieves looked at each other. "Max," said the first one very quietly, "I think I heard the sheep girl yell." "I think I did too," said Max in a quivery voice. "Oh boy, yelling pictures. We both need a rest." "You'll get a rest, all right," shouted Mr. Dart, rushing in with the chief of police and lots of guard and policemen around him. "You'll get a rested, that's what." Ha 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 ha. The sneak thieves were too mixed up by Mr. Dart's joke and too frightened by the policemen to put up a fight. Before they knew it, they had been handcuffed and led away to jail. The next morning, in the office of the chief of police, Stanley Lambchop got a medal. The day after that, his picture was in all of the newspapers. And now, we'll learn about another adventure that Stanley had. Chapter 5. Arthur's Good Idea. For a while, Stanley Lambchop was a famous name. Everywhere the people went, people stared and pointed at him. He could hear them whisper, "Over there, Agnes, over there. That must be Stanley Lambchop, the one who caught the sneak thieves," and things like that. But after a few weeks, the whispering kind of went away and stopped. People had other things to think about. Stanley did not mind. Stanley did not mind. Being famous had been fun, but enough was enough. And then came a further change, and it was not a pleasant one. People began to laugh and make fun of him as he passed by. "Hello, Super Skinny," they would shout, and even ruder things about the way he looked. Stanley told his parents how he felt. "It's the other kids I mostly mind," he said. "They don't like me anymore because I'm different. Flat." "Shame on them," Mrs. Lambchop said. "It is wrong to dislike people for their shapes, or their religion for that matter, or the color of their skin." "I know," Stanley said. "Only maybe it's impossible for everyone to like everyone." "Perhaps," said Mrs. Lambchop, "but they can try." Later that night, Arthur Lambchop was woken by the sound of crying. In the darkness, he crept across the room and knelt by Stanley's bed. "Are you okay?" he asked. "Go away," Stanley said. "Don't be mad at me," Arthur said. "You're still mad because I let you get tangled the day you were my kite, I guess." "Skip it, will you?" Stanley said. "I'm not mad. Go away." "Please, let's be friends," Arthur said. Arthur couldn't help crying a little too. "Oh, Stanley," he said, "please tell me what's wrong." Stanley waited for a long time before he spoke. "The thing is," he said, "I'm just not happy anymore. I'm tired of being flat. I want to be a regular shape again, like other people, but I'll have to go on being flat forever. It makes me sick." "Oh, Stanley," Arthur said. He dried his tears on a corner of Stanley's sheet and could think of nothing more to say. "Oh, Stanley." "Don't talk about what I just said," Stanley told him. "I don't want the folks to worry. That would only make it worse." "You're brave," Arthur said. "You really are." He took hold of Stanley's hand. The two brothers sat together in the darkness, being friends. They were both still sad, but each one felt a little better than he had before. And then suddenly, though he was not even trying to think, Arthur had an idea. He jumped up and turned on the light and ran to the big storage box where toys and things were kept. He began to rummage through the box. Stanley sat up in bed to watch. "What are you doing?" Arthur flung aside a football and some lead soldiers and airplane models and lots of wooden blocks. And then he said, "Aha!" He had found what he wanted, an old bicycle pump. He held it up, and Stanley and he looked at each other. "Okay," Stanley said at last, "but take it easy." He put the end of the long pump hose in his mouth and clamped his lips tightly about it so that no air could escape. "I'll go slowly," Arthur said. "If it hurts or anything, wiggle your hands at me." Arthur began to pump. At first nothing happened except that Stanley's cheeks bulged a bit. Arthur watched his hand, but there was no wiggle signal, so he pumped on. Then suddenly Stanley's top half began to swell. It's working, shouted Arthur, pumping away. Stanley spread his arms so that the air could get inside of him more easily. He got bigger and bigger. The buttons on his pajama top burst off. Pop, pop, pop. A moment more, and he was all rounded out, head and body, arms and legs, but not his right foot. That foot stayed flat. Arthur stopped pumping. "It's like trying to do the very last bit of those long balloons," he said. "Maybe a shake would help." Stanley took his right foot twice, and he shook it. And with a little whooshing sound, it swelled out to match the left one. There stood Stanley Lambchop as he used to be, as if he had never been flat at all. "Thank you, Arthur," Stanley said. "Thank you very much." The brothers were shaking hands when Mr. Lambchop strode into the room with Mrs. Lambchop right behind him. "We heard you," said Mr. Lambchop. "Up and talking when you ought to be asleep, eh? Shame on—" "George," said Mrs. Lambchop. "Stanley's round again." "You're right," said Mr. Lambchop, noticing. "Good for you, Stanley." "I'm the one who did it," Arthur said. "I blew him up." Everyone was terribly excited and happy. Of course, Mrs. Lambchop made hot chocolate to celebrate the occasion, and several toasts were drunk to Arthur and his cleverness. When the little party was over, Mr. and Mrs. Lambchop tucked the boys back into their beds and kissed them, and then they turned out the light. "Good night," they said. "Good night," said Stanley and Arthur. It had been a very long and tiring day. Very soon all the Lambchops were asleep. The end. And that is the end of Flat Stanley. What did you think about that book? Well, I think that it ended really well and that Arthur was super thoughtful of Stanley. Well, you can feel free to let me know if you liked the book and talk to your parents about it, see what they thought. See you later.